I'll say by way of introduction to this topic that I, with the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, I'm the executive director. David, who is also on the call today, is on our board of directors and runs the London Futurists. Let's see, is there anybody else immediately? I don't see anyone else immediately, but we have been around for about 16 years at this point and have now entered into a collaboration with the Applied Ethics Center at UMass Boston, where I'm also associate provost. And Nir Esikovitz, who's also in this talk, had already been running for a couple of years a speaker series on artificial intelligence and human experience. Here's Anders. Okay. And let's see if everyone could mute. I will mute some of you. Let's see. Nir had been running this speaker series already. We're starting a new collaboration around the topic of the future of work. And the questions that we had originally imagined back in 2019 to address with this series had to do principally with automation and the way that automation would change the nature of work. But the COVID crisis has, of course, created a whole new discussion around work, not one that's entirely separate from the automation topic, but one that now addresses the feelings that people have about work that are causing the Great Resignation, at least in Western industrialized countries, and the new interest in and capacity for remote work, people's familiarity with platforms like Zoom, hybrid work situations, et cetera. So we think that there's a frothy set of topics to address over the coming 2 years with this future of work topic. And we, of course, welcome your input as to what kinds of topics we might address. So I'd like to introduce Anders, who's an old friend. Anders and I have known each other, I think, for about 20 years. And I very much always enjoy Anders. He is situated at the philosophy department and the Future of Humanity Institute and the Bioethics Center at Oxford University, and he is truly a Renaissance kind of thinker. I see David nodding, also familiar with Anders's work. He is someone who has a PhD in computational neuroscience, but has written about everything from astrobiology and astrophysics to neurology, philosophy, and so forth. And so every talk that Anders gives is a delightful intervention into important ideas, and I'm looking forward to what he has to say today. Oh, have to keep admitting people, they keep coming in. So Anders, let me turn it over to you. The topic that you are addressing today is, of course, central to our investigations. Do we have to work? What is the value of work, and so forth? So take it away.
Well, thank you, James. I'm delighted to be here, so to say. And I'm also delighted to have this topic to play around with. So let me see if I can share my screen. Hopefully you now are seeing the splash screen, etc. So the reason I'm extra happy about this topic is that it actually forced me to try to deal with a part in my book manuscript that I haven't been working on for a while. And that is post-scarcity and work and automation. All the topics that I'm supposed to be talking about for once, but it was very useful to actually be forced to see what have I written and does it make sense? And generally, the story is that people have been dreaming about lands of plenty since time immemorial and places where everything could be gained with no effort. And then as we automate things and get at least some inklings about that, many turn against it and say, this looks bad. Maybe it's not possible to do, or maybe work is necessary. Or is it that we just suffer from status quo bias? So I'm going to try to play around with these topics a little bit and see what we can figure out. Okay, So that quote I started the talk with, and then work conquers everything, is actually a part of a few lines in Virgil's Georgics. And it actually says, labor omnia vicit improbus et duris urgens in rebus egestas. Toil conquered the world, unrelenting toil, and want that pinches when life is hard. So work conquers everything sounds rather nice, very cheerful. But the actual quote is, oh, we've been suffering so much. And people have been dreaming about a world where you don't have to toil and where you don't have want that pinches. So the picture up there of Luikerland, or known as the land of cocaine in English, that's by Bruggen. And there was many of these medieval stories about the wonderful land where the fried sparrows fly into your mouth. You just need to lie there, and then there comes a rainfall of wine, and you don't need to do anything. You just have extreme luxury. And that is, of course, contrasted with the harshness of being a medieval peasant. And many of these stories were, of course, nice stories to dream about. But as we moved into the early modern and modern era, people started thinking, maybe we can get that. Charles Fourier is an interesting example because he was an early utopian socialist in the 19th century. And he suggested that if we could just fix our social organization, organize ourselves in the right cooperative framework, everything would be fine. And not just socially. The physical world would be affected by the social world, and we would actually turn the oceans into lemonade. The sharks that are bad for us would turn into friendly anti-sharks that would help fishes come into the fishermen's nets. And we would get better moons than the current crappy moon, and the auroras of the North Pole would turn warming and make everything nice. Many friends of utopian socialism have a hard time figuring out what he actually meant by that. I think he was actually being a proper idealist. He actually did think that if we just change our outlook in the right way, the physical world would follow. Later followers who were more interested in his social program, of course, wanted to disregard those anti-sharks, but I find it a totally lovely, if crazy, idea. The interesting thing is, of course, when we start thinking about how do we create a post-work and a post-scarcity society, we need to start looking into what do we even mean by work? And one of the first things to notice is that many societies we know today are totally work or employment centered. So it's not just about the income, but also it's seen as somewhat normative. It's expected to be a central feature of day-to-day life for adults. If you're not working, then there's something wrong with you. You're getting your position in society by the kind of job you have. And it's interesting that in the modern world, of course, we tend to talk about the other parts of human life in work metaphor. Exercise have become working out, and we might be working on our relationships, and we might be talking about emotional labor. And sometimes it's a metaphor. Sometimes it seems that we have this workism that is everywhere. The idea is that work is what defines life, and then there is some side activity. However, when you try to define work properly, it's clear that not all work is employment. There is household work, which is not employed, but still kind of important work. In many cases, people had fixed roles, and that might be that they would be self-employed and would be born to a job. So work might not necessarily involve working for others. You can be self-employed, and you might not be materially compensated. Sometimes we say, oh, work is about that labor, it's exertion, it's toil. But that means that if I like going to my job and I don't regard hanging around the philosophy department as very stressful, am I working here? That seems very odd. It seems like what the definition there tries to get at is that we want to avoid something, but that doesn't get to the social activity. I think a better approach is saying work is something that modifies the world in some way. So Bertrand Russell remarked, work is of two kinds. First, altering the position of matter at or near the Earth's surface relative to other such matter. Second, telling other people to do so. And since then, we might have added information work to it, but we might debate whether the bits actually are material electron patterns. But that definition, he might be quipping a bit about the two kinds, but I think it gets close to something important. Work involves altering the world in presumptively worthwhile ways. And that generates goods that actually reside in the external world, somewhat independent of their creator and maybe their consumers. If I just think up a nice poem, even if it's very hard mental labor for me, but I never tell it to anybody, never write it down, that might actually not really count very much as work. If I write an ever so bad poem and try to sell it to people, I have in some sense worked. Now, the interesting thing here is that by working, we generate these goods, and they are material, usually material objects, but they're also experiences, states of minds or services, and others generally are supposed to value and enjoy in their own right. So it's not really the working itself that matters here, but it's that there is some kind of result. You can say that you try to increase the intersubjective value in the world. Now, when I'm having leisure, on the other hand, I generate value for myself, not for others. So in this case, you might be able to draw some slightly fuzzy line. The sports fisher catches a fish and eats it, performs action that could have been work, fishing, cooking, food reviewing, but now it only serves for their enjoyment. And generally, we enjoy leisure because it's linked to us. We cannot hire people to rest in our place. It's us who need to rest or be enjoying something. But the borders, of course, very hazy. When playing sports, we might be providing goods to our teammates when playing, let's say, soccer. But maybe some people are also watching it and enjoying that. And maybe they're paying me to play soccer. At some point, when I get enough pay, it's presumably work rather than leisure. But the border might be very, very fuzzy. Some people, like Raymond Guess, has suggested that work is necessary for individuals and society as a whole because of scarcity. But we might be moving towards post-scarcity. And then a fair bit of work anyway produces luxuries and extra things that we don't necessarily need, like that poem. It might make the world a better place, but in some sense it's not necessary. So it seems like a lot of the work hinges on that it provides some good to others. However, that leads to another important question. As somebody in the philosophy department, I can always get away with asking, value, what do you mean by that? And the answer is, it's good for somebody. And then we might need to explain why it's good for somebody. And these somebodies can sometimes be rather abstract. There are some people saying, I'm doing God's work. They're actually sometimes literally saying that they're doing something that is in some sense in service of God. The God would say that has value and it's making God's situation better. Or you might say, I'm doing this for the sake of Earth's biosphere. It's not a person. It's not even clear that anything can be good for a biosphere. It might depend on your environmental ethics. But here, again, you have some other agent that might be really different. But normally we say that work gets value from the goods it makes. That's something we generally tend to agree on. Now, if that is the only reason, then work is never worth doing for its own sake. It's only good for the goods that you make and the exchange that means. So you can take this in a hard form or in a softer form, but saying that we care about others to some extent. So we gain back by being part of the market. And this might be, I might be doing the dishes for my husband and he gets happy. In some sense, I'm working for him and his happiness is paying me back. Or I might participate as a scientist in the academic market, providing academic goods. And in return, by being part of this market, me and all other humans are getting various goods by this process between us. But there is another interesting aspect, like that washing the dishes example hints at. And that is, of course, that workplaces, whether that is in the kitchen or in a factory or social. And we're making value usually in a cooperative way. And we know that unemployment is enormously stressful. So clearly work matters beyond the paycheck. And generally this is explained by saying, well, workplaces are social sites and it gives you a sense of community. There is a shared good that everybody gains from that community, at least in a good workplace. There are unfortunately quite a lot of workplaces that are the opposite of that. But in general, the work is where we spend a lot of time and interactions with other people. It's important to us, and not being part of that kind of community can be extremely stressful. Also, some people identify with the professions. And this is not necessarily just a status game, but it might be affiliation. I might feel feeling that I'm an academic. And when I saw the academy in Athens, in Rome, and Raphael's painting of the ancient philosopher, I felt a kind of weird kinship. Yeah, I'm part of that gang on that fresco. And others report similar things. They enjoy being part of something larger. And in some cases, this might even be a case of ego dissolution. Many people really enjoy when they don't have to think about themselves, but they are part of something greater, which might mean that they might want to join the police or army, because those uniforms, they mean something. They're part of a kind of superorganism and can let your ego dissolve, which might or might not be a good thing for society, but it certainly is rewarding for many people. But there is another strand of thinking about what work provides us, and that is, of course, we can work as a way of bettering ourselves. We excel at what we do and realize our potential. And you can come to this from a lot of different approaches. There are some Marxist thinkers that say that, well, we have an active nature and we impart human form to the natural world, which is kind of alien to us. And this way we achieve self-realization. While if I'm just sitting around swigging something that people have prepared for me, just consuming, I'm passive. I'm not actually expressing myself. I'm having others express at me. But you can also start thinking about meaning at work. And you can take a Kantian perspective and say, well, it's grounded in our autonomy. The ideal job is something that you're freely enter into, allows workers to exercise independent judgment and pursue their own ends beside the ends mandated by the employer. So you can take a religious view, and like the medieval monk saying, ora et labora, you need to pray and work to do the good job. Or the Max Weber's Protestant work ethics, where you see work as a stewardship, an act of blessing for others. The problem here is, of course, not everything is a blessing for others. As David Graeber wrote in his book, The Bullshit Jobs, there is quite a lot of jobs that don't feel meaningful at all to the people doing it. And that is in itself deeply, deeply stressful. Knowing that your only job is kind of fixing the errors others are doing in an organization. But if you tighten up the standards a bit, your job would not be needed, but people don't care enough to tighten up standards, is thoroughly bad emotionally. But in general, it seems like what we can arrive at is that work produces goods for others and ourselves. While the material external goods might matter very much instrumentally, philosophically and psychologically, there are many of these subjective or social goods that matter too. So the little kid moving the lawn for their parents for a few dollars, what they're doing is not so much instrumentally providing the service of moving a lawn, because dad can probably do that more effectively than the little kid. But the kid will feel a sense of accomplishment. It will be part of a social network of a family, maybe be able to wave at neighbors who are also moving their lawn, and so on. And might think back at, yes, I made my first $5 by moving my dad's lawn. There is a lot of good things going on here, or at least that is the idea. The problem is, of course, many people actually don't think work is a good thing at all. There is a fair bit of critique of this. Now, I think most of it is about current social conditions and the economic system, etc. So, for example, the anarchist Bob Black opens his famous essay, The Abolition of Work, by saying, no one should ever work. Work is the source of nearly all the misery in the world. Almost any evil you'd care to name comes from working or from living in a world designed for work. In order to stop suffering, we have to stop working. But here he defines work as forced labor. That is compulsory production. So his abolition of work is essentially making individuals voluntarily engaged in productive activities. So he's not saying that the factories need to close. It's rather that it should be voluntary to show up at the factory. And here, of course, we can get into an interesting discussion about, well, what's wrong with the labor market? What are the structural features of economy that are really bad and really hard to improve? And you might argue, for example, that very important justice elements where workers do not get the goods that they should have, whether they are material or the psychological, philosophical goods. There are issues here about just compensation, good workplaces. But the basic argument is not against work itself. It's just by being forced to do it. I think one can make other critiques of work, saying like, labor is not good in itself. The previous list, the one I made on the previous slide about various philosophical and psychological things, they are actually just imaginary things. The real thing that matters in work is just producing the products. And that in itself is not valuable at all, except that we want the products. If they just magically appeared or we had robots doing them, that would be perfect. Then we could do it. Another slightly more complicated case is that there might be tensions between the work goods. So meaning and payment might be anti-correlated. I might be able to take a really meaningful job, but it's going to be having a low pay. Or I might get a well-paid job, but it's not going to be meaningful. Or it might even be motivational anti-correlated. I might be writing poetry, but if people start paying me for that poetry, my motivation might go down. So here we might have a fundamental problem. There might also be issues here about opportunity costs. So the time I spend working could have been spent on more worthwhile things like building Lego constructions with my niece and nephews. There might also be various physical or psychological bads, ranging from alienation over to distorting our priorities for money, to make us see ourselves as instrumental cogs in the machine, or negative externalities of working or the work we choose to do. After all, there are some careers that are probably net making the world a worse place. Also, it might be that we could generate other goods in other ways. So the anarchist might say that maybe we could do it using play or cooperative activities or voluntary projects. But it seems to me that there's still clearly a lot of tasks that need doing. Making food, comforting the sad, stopping disasters that are worth doing and might be regarded as work, but they're also actually worth doing. Now, the interesting question here is, do we have to work? And there seem to be two fundamentally bad things about work. One is toil and one is restriction. So restriction has to do with our social organization and what follows from how we go about doing that. So this is that we have to do what our employer tells us, that we might be stuck in an economic system that's no good, etc. And I'm going to leave that to the side. It's a pretty obviously big topic, but I'm more interested in the toil part here, because toil comes from the necessity of doing some things even when they're no fun. And this is a part that's much more tied to the outside physical world than our social organization problems. And this is, of course, where I'm getting happy as somebody from the natural sciences, because physical world I can say so much more about than that tricky world of human interactions. So if we could remove that necessity, then much of the compulsoriness disappears. So bad forms of organization might be possible to avoid by walking out. This doesn't necessarily fix everything. If somebody holds you at gunpoint to polish in their boots, you still have a problem, even if you do not have to polish boots for a living normally. So we still might want to fix those social and power issues. But in a world where you have scarcity, you might have to polish boots just to save yourself. So a post-scarcity world would be a state where most goods can be produced in great abundance with minimal human labor, so that they're in principle freely available and basic survival needs can be met, and ideally most other needs. It's a little bit like the world we might be having for pens. Right now, advertising is making it so cheap to make pens and pencils, but most of us don't have a scarcity of pens. Most of us have desks overflowing with pens up until the point when we actually need one. Then they mysteriously disappear. But the interesting thing here is that the utopia vision of post-scarcity is not just about satisfying needs and wants, and hence removing a lot of dissatisfaction, but also there's hope that this will remove the competition, the unpleasant labor, and the hard trade-offs, which in turn would reduce conflicts and deliberately thwarted preferences. And many of the trade-offs we have to do these days involve moral trade-offs, and we are kind of all complicit in something these days. In order to function in this world, you probably needed to have a smartphone, a lot of electronics, and that means that we are in some sense complicit in the trade of various elements from various zones in the world that we might prefer not to think too much about. In a post-scarcity world, we might hopefully not have to be complicit in many bad things, and that might be also morally and ethically good. But that's the hope. can we actually say something about the physics of work? And I think we can say that the physical world is dominated by energy, entropy, matter, and forces, plus information. Work is basically causing rearrangement of these according to our goals. And this is constrained by the availability of stuff, what it can act on or transform what, and our ability to influence this and the knowledge to achieve this. And the rules for this are timeless. They were essentially in place right at the moment of the Big Bang. What can react to what happens when you connect different cogwheels in a cuckoo clock. That was in some sense already set in some Platonic form in the Big Bang. But we have an availability that's contingent. We have a certain amount of gold and iron on Earth, which depended on which asteroids hit it in the past. But the knowledge is growing. And of course, what you can do with 1 liter of oil is changing tremendously as we know more and more about chemistry, biochemistry, biotechnology, nanotechnology. That oil is going from something that Paracelsus was suggesting was a decent laxative to something that's now is an important part of our energy system and chemical system, and in the future might get enormous other uses when we have nanotechnology to knit together that carbon into new forms. And we know that many really wild things are possible since they exist in nature. We do have self-replicating, self-maintaining systems that can manipulate the environment from the molecular to the planetary scale. And they can produce everything from apples to poisons to caves and so on. And generally, we know that our productivity is kind of increasing. New technology and new organizational forms and new knowledge is arriving. So to kind of spoil a bit, but it's pretty obvious that the physical limits appear very, very loose by current human standards. If we could get anywhere close to the physical limits of productivity, etc., we would be amazingly rich in a material sense. However, can we get there? And what does that even mean? So underlying a society that can achieve a lower absence of scarcity, there seems to be that we need certain things. So we need the raw materials, either new raw materials from unclaimed nature or recycled material. We need energy, allowing useful work to be done, and a way of removing the resulting entropy, which can sometimes be much harder. We need space to do it in, places where new things can be located or done. Not everybody can have a lakeside villa near Lake Como in Italy. We need an enormous amount of space for solar power connectors, for example. We also need cognition, minds or other information processing systems that can control, think, interact, and perform other necessary mental tasks, because the information processing aspect is increasingly becoming important. We need the transformation ability, the ability to convert the raw material energy and cognition into things and services that help to achieve these functions. And finally, we need coordination, solving the basic economic problems, allocating these resources in such a way that the post-scarcity situation is possible. And that includes, of course, avoiding externalities like pollution or handling competition in the right way. Generally, when people talk about post-scarcity economics, they all go for the coordination function. And generally, this is where you bring up your favorite political ideology and explain that if we only implemented this one, we're going to get post-scarcity, because then we're going to coordinate perfectly and then all the other problems are solved. I think that is actually being too glib. Just because you know how to organize something really well doesn't mean that you can actually do certain things. Just because you have a right political organization doesn't mean that you know how to actually make a solid diamond. But it's still an important issue here. And it might also be that if you solve some of the other problems, adding extreme productivity might also offset deadweight losses if your political system is not perfect. If nearly anything can be produced efficiently, maybe there might be no need for price mechanisms, except that I have a suspicion that there's likely that if you can just produce arbitrary amount of stuff, you're going to be getting massive waste and externalities. You're going to end up with piles of stuff. Anyway, well, what can we say about post-scarcity technology? And this is, of course, something that probably ideally should be a lecture series, but I'm not going to impose that on you. I'm going to try to do this in 10 minutes. Yeah, nanotechnology, that was such a 90s thing. And then they believe that, well, it didn't go anywhere. But what mostly happened was the field turned into nanoscience rather than nanoengineering. A lot of very interesting research about things rather than trying to build things that could do something. right now, the advances in nanotechnology, protein engineering, microelectronics, and computational chemistry actually makes me think we're almost overdue for things happening. There might be an overhang there. And even if classic atomically precise manufacturing does not happen, biotechnology is moving very fast and producing results. Again, it's very hard to predict exactly how fast an area like that moves. But it seems like both of them represent technologies that allow for high productivity, high efficiency, and very new applications. So the productivity part comes from working in a massive parallel scale, where the number of operations per second becomes very large because you're also doing it on a very small scale. That speeds up things. And the smaller pieces can then be combined for larger results. And this is where nanotechnology has a real advantage over biology, because biology has an enormous overhead for maintaining cells and having systems that can self-replicate. While on the other hand, nanotechnology can make specialized systems that are high performance for just one thing. Similarly, we can get high efficiency, which I think is important because the traditional picture of a post-scarcity industry from the mid-20th century was gigantic factories belching out smoke from smokestacks. And today we're a bit too environmentally conscious to really like that idea. The basic thing is large-scale technology back then would have been high energy intensity technology. While most biology demonstrates that you can actually do quite sophisticated things on a large scale at ambient temperature rather than heating everything to a very high temperature. The Haber-Bosch process in industry requires several hundred degrees Celsius when you run the gases through the pipes, while the soil bacteria outside my window doing nitrogen fixation, they do it at a normal British temperature. And by moving towards kind of thermodynamical equilibrium, being almost closer, you can trade off speed for being very, very energy efficient. And this could allow exceedingly green technologies. And then we, of course, got the radical new abilities. I don't plan to talk much about self-replication. I think it's actually a red herring in this regard. Another interesting thing is that Moore's law is still doing surprisingly fine, even though we've been predicting its death for decades. And what's going on here is that the computations per second per dollar are still declining exponentially, even though we're changing architecture, moving to more parallel architectures. Why does this matter? Well, some of it is, of course, automation in the normal sense. Some of it might be remote working. Indeed, energy might be the limiting factor. But I think the big deal here is AI machine learning, which is on an exceedingly powerful upward swing. And this is important because if we manage to make the perfect factory for making all our material goods, that's still only a smaller part of our economy. It's the services, somebody manning that factory, distributor things, that actually make things expensive. And if we could actually just automate that, then we would get much more effect. It seems like right now we are kind of struggling with making automation adaptive. And this is where I think current machine learning is right on track. It might not necessarily be getting to artificial general intelligence anytime soon. I'm somewhat more pessimistic than some of my colleagues here at the Institute, even though I think safety work is very important for AGI. But it seems like if you have adaptive automation that can act in general environments with somewhat human-like skills and ability to cooperate, then you would actually be able to transform many factories and production systems enormously. And with that kind of narrow AI cognition, then transformation and coordination requirements of post-scarcity can be produced on demand, making them very, very cheap. Even if you have only narrow AI that only works in particular domains, that makes it much more powerful. And I think we often underestimate the power that comes from artificial narrow intelligence. We should remember that most animals are also narrowly intelligent and do quite well. And we can build large library of artificial narrow intelligence talents that can be built and invoked as needed, and then the speed set by available hardware. And services, as I mentioned, they make up about 63.6% of the nominal world GDP in 2015, probably more now. That is a large chunk. And this dominates over in the manufacturing, agriculture, resource extraction. And so far, services have typically require a lot of labor content. But if you get some automation, this is where I think it has a very big effect, and that brings down the prices a lot. So if you can mass produce services, this has traditionally involved organizing many human service providers efficiently rather than replace it with automation. But if you could automate it, then we should expect that this has a big impact. So to summarize this somewhat messy summary of a fictional lecture series, the normal process of making our productivity better, but these are slow on a human timescale because they're about humans adapting to technology and each other. But new processes have appeared that are growing rapidly, maybe exponentially, we might argue about that. That one enables more high productivity process, and two allows greater complementarity and substitutability of human labor. And this means that regardless of whether there is work, there's certainly going to be more stuff and services around. Okay, now let's see if we can bring these things together a little bit. I know I'm running out of time, but post-scarcity economics is kind of a funny topic even, because Lionel Robbins famously defined economics as the science which studies human behavior as a relationship between ends and scarce means which have alternative uses. So from this standpoint, post-scarcity economics sounds like a contradiction in terms. But economics is actually a much wider subject than this. We will likely there will be plenty to do for economists in even a post-scarcity utopia, I think. And indeed, economists, of course, have been talking about post-scarcity in very mainstream form. John Maynard Keynes writes in his general theory, I look forward, therefore, in days not so very remote, to the greatest change which has ever occurred in the material environment of life for human beings in the aggregate. But, of course, it will all happen gradually, not as a catastrophe. Indeed, it has already begun. The course of affairs will simply be that there will be ever larger and larger classes and groups of people for whom problems of economic necessity have been practically removed. Now, he was pretty optimistic that humanity was solving its economic problems as evidenced by just global economic growth. And then he would argue that as we fix our consumption needs, we will focus on other values. And he was thinking that we just get on this path by doing the right investment and following the right macroeconomic path. He wasn't exactly talking about an exotic technology like I was talking one slide ago. Or rather, he would probably say that we will invent the necessary exotic technologies, whatever it will be, if we do the right macroeconomics. Another important and rather obvious thing is, of course, scarcity always relative to needs and wants. So we might imagine that if we all turned into a society of ascetics, we would be suddenly post-scarce even with the current resources because we just don't want it. But you can also imagine post-scarcity along different dimensions. So you might imagine an uploaded solid-state civilization that might have important scarcity of computer memory and computer power, but don't care very much about material goods in the outside world. But most of the discussions, of course, have been about material goods. And you can kind of analyze what functions they do in satisfying our needs. So you might say it's survival, and that's food, life support, healthcare, safety, individual flourishing, education, freedom, identity construction, and management of our desires, social flourishing, family and social interaction, entertainment and culture, and civilizational goods, sustainability, science, reducing existential risk. And these functions can be provided through various products and services. And they, of course, require their own inputs, also supported by some kind of infrastructure. So one can keep on defining this in very different ways, and there's some other schemes, but I'll leave it at that. Now, the interesting thing is economic growth is only predicated on the material inputs up to a point, partially because of its needs and wants separation, but also that we can do quality improvements. Something can become worth more without requiring more inputs. After all, the value of a Mona Lisa might be increasing over time if we appreciate it more highly, even though the physical painting is not changing. And generally, there is an interesting question whether our mindset could allow us to have infinite economic growth. I have a paper with David Mannheim where I'm arguing that there is actually an upper limit to economic and moral value because of the finiteness of possible minds. But this is a limit which is probably mostly of interest to philosophers because it's so far above anything that is plausible for us to care about in the current physical universe that it's beside the point. Still, there are some ultimate limits on economic growth, but we're not talking about that. We're just talking about the near post-scarcity by current human standards. We might, of course, worry that at that point, when we get there, we're going to want more. If I can get one space station, why not two? What about a trillion space stations? So there are interesting questions about how we can satisfy our wants and whether we might also want to have a special good of modifying our desires. Another important thing is, of course, adding new forms of products and services that didn't exist beforehand. It's kind of an interesting thing to imagine a future world that has everything we currently have, and you can get as much of it as you want, but nothing else. And the smartphones are just as good as we currently are. The software is just as good as it currently is. The food is just as good, and you can get as many smartphones and ice cream as you want, but you can't get any new and better taste. It feels almost like that static post-scarcity world is lacking something important. We actually think new things have an inherent value. Anyway, that gets me over to the question about, well, can you actually get total post-scarcity? And surprise, surprise, I don't think we can. There are things like time that you cannot produce. We can speed up our processes, which means that we use less time to achieve something, or we can do more in a given amount of clock time, but we can't make time. We just get it 1 second at a time. Orbital location, radio spectrum are naturally finite resource that we just need to allocate one way or another. And sometimes we can, of course, be clever with our technology to make the scarce good appear abundant because we have some distribution layer. So we might, as a radio user, not notice that our cell phones are switching between different cells and different frequencies in order to not get on each other's toes. So to us, it looks like we have way more radio spectrum than we actually have, right up until the point when this system fails and suddenly the ether is jammed. One really important and, in my mind, very troubling one is that social status is typically somewhat of a zero-sum game, where relative rankings within a context matter. It's not possible for every individual at a party to be the most popular person. Now, maybe some of us might be congregate in one corner and play the game of being the most well-cited academic, and we wave around our papers in Nature, while the athletes in the other corner are talking about how well they did in the field. But we still, inside our own group, have a zero-sum status game. And this is, of course, a bit of a problem because many jobs exist to fulfill social desires and might persist even in a material abundant future. So this is where I actually think Graeber's bullshit jobs might come in to bite, really. I think his book is wrong about how many current jobs are totally meaningless. I think he's overcounting that. But it could be that in a materially abundant future, we might have far too many bullshit jobs, people getting roped in for social reasons. And that might be very maladaptive and might want to find ways out of that. And much behavior in an abundant setting might be just social signaling. And that might cause an enormous amount of grief and drama and entertainment, of course. And of course, there is this issue about wants that can never be fully satisfied. But it also seems like there are some social needs that you can satisfy, while other ones you just need to reformulate. I have a discussion about kind of excludable and non-excludable and rival and non-rival goods in a post-scarcity setting, but I'm running out of time. So my main part here is saying that it looks like a post-scarcity society might retain club goods, and not all common goods will become abundant, but it looks like provision of public goods is likely to become far better. So it seems like different goods, even in a post-scarcity setting, might have a complicated distribution. There might also be abundance pollution, but there are some goods that are no longer scarce, but we can start spamming the world with it. If I want to put up life-size statues of myself, I might spam the world and reduce your enjoyment of it because you don't want those statues. So we get a lot of interesting coordination problems about this. Another common argument is you can't really have post-scarcity because the population will grow in a Malthusian manner until it fills things up. But this one, I think we have licked so far. The Industrial Revolution meant that we decoupled the increase in productivity from an increase in population. Instead, we got a better standard of living. And the question is, can we just make sure that this decoupling persists indefinitely? And you can be a pessimist and saying sooner or later that's going to fail, or you can be an optimist saying, actually, so far, our social organization have been fairly good. Population control seems to be actually doable. And it might be possible to find better ways to coordinate against these outcomes. This might also not just be people that are multiplying. It might be artificial intelligences. It might be natural parks. There might be other things that we generate too much of. There might also be some people saying, actually, post-scarcity is bad for you. We should avoid it. I think it's very unlikely that they are going to win the argument and convince everybody globally that we're going to stay away from those matter compilers and helpful robots forever. But certainly there are going to be interesting issues of coordination here. There are also a good question about stagnation, but I don't have the time to get into that. Let's try to put things together. It seems to me that the transition from the present to a world of massive automation is likely to be very, very uneven. And different things are differently automatable and have different constraints. So we have the Osborne and Frey's old paper where they argued that different jobs have different probabilities of being automated. I think we can critique a lot of their assumptions, but it's very clear that it's an uneven distribution, and we might get surprises where certain technologies advance much faster. There is also very important gender and national differences. When I looked at Sweden, I noticed that the most male jobs were also much more automatable by Osborne and Frey's estimation, because they involve things like truck driving and some forms of programming, while many of the jobs that were heavily female, they were much less automatable. So you might get these interesting effects if you get a sudden shift in automatability. And generally, from a practical standpoint, a world with cheap, ubiquitous services would probably be more radical than a world of cheap physical goods. After all, its inhabitants could get whatever help they requested in the project, whether that's painting, researching, or fighting. And that seems to suggest that the political turbulence might be really big, no matter what happens here. It's also an interesting question, would a full automated world be a post-work world? And many of the external goods can be produced, but there are some interesting exceptions. For example, I sometimes joke that priests, politicians, and prostitutes have kind of safe jobs. The reason is, of course, the priest is supposedly having a spiritual connection. We care about it being a being that has a soul in the right way, depending on the religion. Although it's worth noting that in Japan, there are some robot monks. Politicians are having a representative position. So it's not that they're making great decisions or being particularly charismatic, but they represent us in a sense. So it's not so much that you can have a robot do that job. Probably. Again, some people might disagree about this, but very interesting things like prosecutors, where maybe the legal skill is not as important as having somebody taking the moral responsibility of representing the state's interests. And the prostitutes, well, leaving aside the sex robot, there is something about having a person and being intimate with a person that might matter. So there are some jobs where probably people are going to say, here, robots are not suitable. We can't put this into software. But there are also an important sphere of social psychological need for work that we talked about that remains no matter what you do. So unless you can make robot co-workers and robot friends to get that, you're still going to need some form of organization like that. And even if work might not be necessary, maybe from a material standpoint, you might still find it necessary from a social, emotional, or philosophical standpoint. And this is where it's interesting to look at natural experiments with universal basic income. And generally, the discussion is, of course, the standard trick when you bring out maybe AI is going to lead to unemployment. And then people hope that universal basic income fixes it. But we could argue that Saudi Arabia has universal basic income if you're in any way related to the royal family. And generally, it seems like many of these people are not terribly happy, even though they're very affluent in a material sense. It really shows that the socio-cultural framing clearly matters. And many of the natural and the deliberate experiments people have been doing on this demonstrate that in some places it works really well, in others it doesn't. So it seems like having all you need, but also no need for the right kind of human contact can be really bad for you. If you can come up with a way of framing it so the human contact is good, then it works better. There are other interesting issues we might want to talk about later, like addiction or dependency on technology. But generally, I want to get to the main point that I think, are we approaching a post-scarcity, post-work future? And I think it's pretty likely. Maybe not as quickly as some of us want, but I think we're getting there much faster than most people expect. Indeed, some people might argue that we're already there. George Bataille actually proposed in his book, The Cursed Share, that life on Earth already is a post-scarcity economy. Solar energy already provides more than enough wealth for organisms to handle, and unless we can soak it up by growth and reproduction, they will have to waste it without gain as luxury or destructive pursuits. And then he linked this excess with human pursuits of art, sex, and war. And his theory, of course, had more impact in literature and continental philosophy than economics, but I think it does point out that many systems may not be as scarcity dominated as commonly assumed, especially if one views scarcity as a mismatch between wants and the resources. Also, we might end up with some very peculiar effects if we get to very post-scarce societies. It seems, however, that work is likely to remain in post-scarcity due to human nature and what we might well want to generate it, just to soak up the excess energy. Could we get to a post-work but not post-scarcity society? That sounds much less stable. There is also this interesting concept from Eric Drexler about Paretotopia, where he points out that large cakes are easier to share. Right now, we are having a lot of struggles about equality and sharing resources. And many of these struggles are because we have a small cake to share. What if it became 1,000 times larger? The interesting thing is, as long as you have a convex utility function, that makes the frontier in that the leftmost diagram much flatter. The difference in utility to me for getting 100 or 1,000 cakes is very small, because I can't eat that many cakes anyway. It's just more cakes than I can eat. So if James gets 1,000,000 cakes and I merely get 1,000 cakes, I think we're both equally satiated. I might be totally fine with him getting 1,000 times more cakes. It simply seems that, at least in some domains, an enormous abundance actually makes struggles over exact fairness much less relevant. We're not complaining too much about who got the most pens in the office. Many people will probably have a hard time buying that. And there is another interesting discussion about the weaknesses of the Paretotopian argument. But I think in general, a world that has more resources is much easier to figure out solutions that make people not too worse off than a world that has less resources. So finally, what should we be working on next? Where does this picture lead us? I think we have a whole bunch of practical problems to solve, and in some sense, humanity is pushing towards them. But maybe we need to push harder and actually recognize that there is a gigantic pie there in the future that we want to share. So we might want to actually work much harder on getting sustainable, renewable energy in large amounts. We might want to push for safe biotechnology and molecular manufacturing. We really want to develop technologies like recycling and entropy dispersion, which is incidentally the space people are actually working very hard on accidentally and might be much more useful on Earth than in space. They have the obvious thing about the automation revolution, where I think value alignment, which is normally framed as a safety problem. We need to make sure our AIs understand what we tell them, because otherwise they might mess up the world. We might also turn it into actually a problem of making a livable working environment. We actually want them to understand what we want, not just give us what we ask for, but actually figuring out that instead of getting endless food, Anders maybe wants to do something meaningful with his life. Let's goad him into doing that, even if he doesn't like it at first. So value alignment is also quite important for making AI that is also making our lives valuable. I think there is also some areas where we don't do much research, but I think are ripe for doing interesting discoveries, like well-being post-scarcity. How can we actually generate much more well-being? I'm involved with a project with the Happiness Foundation where we're thinking about that. And part of it, I'm thinking about how to remove the lack of well-being and the negative side, because that's also much safer. But our technologies might help us develop well-being of various kinds, which again raises very interesting questions about value alignment and what kinds of well-being we want to have a post-scarcity of. There is an interesting issue of science post-scarcity. After all, in some sense, the idea of a technological singularity is that you generate systems that can generate all the science and all the technology, and once you have all of that, all the other problems are solved, which might be a bit too glib. It might be just like Francis Fukuyama discovered in the 90s and the early noughties, that just because one kind of history ends, another one might very well start. But what I think is the really under-researched things, and this is where our community might be poking at really new questions, is thinking about technologies of meaning, not just well-being in the emotional and personality sense, but actually, how do I construct apps that help people have meaningful lives or do meaningful things in the world? How do we construct institutions that generate meaning? We are very good at moving matter and energy around. We're decent at moving information around. We're still rather bad at meaning. The question about peritotopia, is that a great motivator? Is this just promising pie in the sky when you die? And it might be better arguments, or maybe even justice arguments might be more powerful. Also, coming from an institute rather famous for a doom and gloom and apocalypses, it's interesting to think about what pathways are there. And can we put in safeguards along them so we don't go down the dystopian roads? There are some jobs that I think we morally ought to automate. We need to automate healthcare so everybody can get it. But I'm a bit afraid of automating policing and military force, because then you get a turnkey system where the political power can just turn the police against the population with no fear of the police saying, no, we're actually citizens too. So there are important questions here about these safeguards. Can we construct them? And whether we can get to the gay space communism and whether that's even a good idea remains to be seen. But I think there are clear directions of improvement. And I think we're at the start of quite a lot of interesting work on improving work. Thank you.
Wow. Anders, as usual, you are a rock star. Unfortunately, you attract rock star attentions, which is novel for us. We have not yet figured out what we're going to do. I think we're going to do webinars in the future, but Neera and I will talk about it. Thank you for all of those who sent in suggestions for how to deal with this disruption. This is our
distributed cognition.
That's right, exactly. And you did highlight John Danaher's book there towards the end, and he is the next speaker in this series.
Read his book.
Yes.
It's good.
Yes, it's a good book. So in 2 weeks, we will have John, and then 2 weeks after that, we'll have Rita Kadri from MIT, who's been doing research on the effects of distributed work environments and artificial intelligence on worker solidarity and worker mutual aid and things like that. So those are the next 2 talks. I see one hand up. Johan, do you want to go ahead and ask a question?
Sure, thanks a lot. That was a really tour de force. There were so many different really interesting topics, but 2 main questions, some of which you already addressed, but I thought would be really interesting to hear more of your thoughts on. So it seems to me that like one really important basic problem that might, not be solved with material post-scarcity is that human psychology, first of all, requires some scarcity for well-being. Maybe not existential scarcity, but some form of scarcity. And the other is that our wants and needs are not structured in a way that if they are satisfied, they will just stay satisfied, right? So that they are potentially such that they're infinitely, once we have, as you mentioned this, I think, once I have 10 couches, why wouldn't I want an 11th one? Or, maybe it's not a couch that I want then, but, something like that. And the other question, which I wondered if you could say more on, is you kind of brushed aside sort of the social structure questions about, we're surrounding this a lot. And I feel like this is really, however, really central to discussing this topic, because any scarcity questions are always, seems to me, necessarily bound up with power, and the way we distribute power and distribute the right to violence and all of this seems to be extremely essential to thinking about whether we need to work or, whether we'll have to work. So I was wondering what you think about those 2 topics in relation, if you could say something a little bit more about the relation to post-scarcity and the need for work.
Yeah, so the second one first, well, basically that's a big one, and I'm not as good as some other people in the audience here on thinking about that. I think it's a different kind of lecture, but I think is important. I think you're totally right, but we need to look at, I think people have been looking at power a little bit more than the actual physical aspect of scarcity. I actually think that there is something that must be made of, can we say something about where the possibilities for getting rid of that material side first happened, because that informs then a lot of discussion about power. For example, when you start thinking about automation, you become very interested in, okay, who has the power over the automation? It's not just the means of production here, it's the means of service and everything else. And if somebody has root access to that, that's a form of power that's kind of even more dramatic. And of course, if we manage to achieve well-being post-scarcity, and it's all controlled by some little smart app we have, and somebody has root access to our well-being, whoa, that's a power that's even more dramatic. So I'm happy to kind of talk about that as a separate seminar, because I think it merits an enormously big seminar. The first part is interesting because there is that fear that what if you got everything you wanted? And to cite Willy Wonka, well, he was happy ever after, of course. The trick here is, of course, everything you ever wanted, it can be read both as my normal wishes, but it might also be read as, oh, I don't know, I should wish for certain things. And indeed, if you imagine that there was a benign superintelligence kind of trying to give me a good life, it might give me a power outage where I need to suddenly get away from my virtual reality suit and get out because the house is on fire. And that was very dramatic and cool. And then I feel a bit like a hero afterwards, which is actually a useful form of scarcity and limitation and apparent danger. So what you want to do is construct situations that actually challenge you. Now, that example of a power outage and fire is kind of a they're made up thing, but many of the most interesting and challenging jobs are the ones where the difficulty depends on where you are. When you try to solve a mathematical problem, quite soon you gravitate to the one that is just on the edge of what you can solve. You get bored by the ones you can't solve, you pass through the easy ones. And where you're at that edge, you experience flow states. In this case, it's fairly natural because of the structure of solving maths problems. And I think we might want to see, can we structure other parts of our social and physical world so we get the right kind of challenges? I'm delighted, for example, that my new office building is located awkward in relation to the bus lines of Oxford. So I can't be lazy and just jump onto the bus and get here. I have to walk every day, either all the way along a beautiful canal or half of the way, which still gives me some much needed exercise. So there is something interesting about constructing systems that constrain us in the right way. And of course, at this point, a lot of old moralists and philosophers would be nodding, but we might also start talking about political coordination and managing externalities. There are the positive externalities of getting some constraints or interesting limits, and we need to talk much more about. Okay, that was a promised micro lecture, sorry.
Thanks a lot.
Do we have another question? Matthias says, can you elaborate on the problem of how humans can find meaning and purpose in a post-work environment? I mean, you've touched on a lot there, but if you could just reiterate your point. Artificially created games and challenges catered to humans, advanced drugs providing satisfaction. I think this...
Yeah, but there is also something about the social thing. You want to have co-workers. And it's an interesting thing because I have my friends I play board games and role-playing games with, and I have my friends I interact with as friends. But I also have some people I just share an office with because we're working on related problems. And then they might be very different from me. And that still creates an interesting community because I encounter people I have not quite chosen, but we have some overlap because we're working on something related. There is a lot of value in that, and constructing ways of bringing people together is valuable. This might also be linked to urbanism. What's the value of having a city if we can all do telework and hybrid interactions and telepresence? Well, you still want to run into people at random. You still want to strike up conversation with strangers, or sometimes getting maybe stuck in an elevator and having to make small talk. These things are useful. And I think the problem is necessity was a very effective way of bringing us together. If something is arbitrary, we might opt out of it. But many things we might choose to make non-arbitrary. We might actually want to set up social rules or institutions that force it. Then we're always going to be having a little tension about where to set the rules, how many people can participate in a meeting. Are we going to be an entrance fee into the really cool virtual reality? Or are we going to try to get that informal network of transhumanists trying to solve some biological problem into a formal network. So they also have to fill out forms together and make small talk, which might be boring on its own, but also forces them to form a social unit that might actually get a lot of value down the line.
Well, I feel emotionally exhausted and intellectual. Oh, okay, we'll take David, and then probably that'll be the last question. Go ahead, David.
Great presentation, Anders. My question,
Thank
I'm
you.
afraid, is about power as well, bargaining power. I've been looking at the recent article by Eric Brynjolfsson. He calls it the Turing trap. He argues that if we just let AI developers do what they want, they're going to develop technology which will allow all human tasks to be automated. Therefore, people won't have anything to do in the workplace, and we will lose our bargaining power. And if we don't have any bargaining power, what is there to ensure that we will still get a reasonable access to some of the fruits of abundance, and that those who still have jobs will be persuaded to share some of that with us instead of leaving us all behind? And Brynjolfsson in this article, as you may know, says, well, we should put more effort onto doing, I guess, what you've said, Anders, which is developing AI to enhance human meaning or in augmenting humans. So do you have any other thoughts about how we can ensure that those who are displaced from the workplace don't end up alienated and left behind, developing a terrible state for society?
Yeah, I'm reminded of a science fiction novel, Beggars and Choosers by Nancy Kress. In my opinion, it's not her best novel. Beggars in Spain, the previous one in the series, is better. But in this setting, what has happened is that it's basically a post-scarcity society, because there are transhumans around and they have been super effective. And basically 80% of the American population are called livers, because they're living the life. So they're basically living on universal basic income, and they've got one bargaining chip. They are a large group of people, so they can vote for political representatives. After all, America is still a democracy. So they vote for representatives, and that is what they are mainly doing. And then it's bread and circuses to them. Meanwhile, there is kind of the remaining 20% of transhumans kind of making the whole infrastructure working, and a tiny, tiny group of super intelligent people who are up to something in the novel, maybe preserving, maybe upsetting the status quo. The interesting thing here is that that bargaining power feels in the novel very bad. Because, well, you can choose different kinds of bread and circuses. In some sense, they're actually not choosing the society, because they're not actually participating in the meaningful core of a society, the part that actually makes the actual decisions about how things work. And the question is, what kind of bargaining power do you have or need to interact with that core? And I think one of the key parts is you actually need knowledge too. I think we actually have a tremendous problem right now, that we have a lack of information, knowledge, and even kind of in understanding of how the infrastructure of our societies work, which means that many people who could vote and participate in principle, in practice cannot do very much, because they don't understand what is going on, where the levers of power are. So then they easily fall for the populists, because, well, they seem to have some kind of solution. They don't fully understand the environmental or economic impacts of different policies, so they choose the one that makes most emotional sense. In some sense, they lose their bargaining power. They become easy to manipulate, because they don't actually catch the right levers of power. Now, this unfortunately doesn't lead to an easy prescription, because saying, oh yes, everybody needs to have a vast education, yeah, that's easier said than done. Even if we imagine that we can have cognitive enhancement and the automated teachers everywhere, still a lot of people will rather want to watch the TV. They don't want their Netflix to be interrupted by somebody trying to teach them about the political economy of their society. But I do think there's interesting issues about what kinds of power exist in a society. And I think there are more kinds than we normally talk about. It's not just economic power. It's not bargaining power. There is the technological power, and even in some sense mimetic power. And we might want to inventory them and see, can we enhance some of them, so the majority of people have at least some forms of power that matters to them.
And I want to thank you for that wonderful quote from the General Theory from John Maynard Keynes. And Keynes is often quoted from his 1930 essay, to a letter to our grandchildren. I hadn't heard that quote, so afterwards I'm going to replay this recording and track down that quote, because it seemed very prescient.
Yeah, he was ahead of his time in many ways.
Anders, I'm going to ask you one more question. That's from Didier. He asked, and I think you addressed this in your talk about David Graeber, unfortunately late David Graeber, his idea about bullshit jobs. And if you could just say, you agree with David that 25% of work in the industrialized world is meaningless, does nothing for the world and nothing for the people, and therefore we just shouldn't be doing that anymore. And why do we keep doing it, and how can we stop doing that?
I'm not certain it's 25% or what the number is. There definitely these jobs certainly do exist, and there are more of them than there should be, almost by definition. Why does it happen? Well, a lot of it has to do with humans being social. So having a lot of flunkies around you, that's something a lot of people like because it enhances your social status. So they are going to do that, and that's going to happen in a post-scarcity world too. In many ways, if you think about the hangers-on of rock stars, many of them are flunkies. They're doing very meaningless things, but they might even feel good about it, which is even more sad. The really annoying ones are, of course, the bullies, kind of doing the negative form of social dominance. We might want to work on a society where that's less acceptable, and where your reputation actually gets impaired if you send bullies to bully other people. But then you have the really sticky ones, the box checkers, making sure that various routines are performed, or the duct tapers, fixing things when these routines, which are not fit for reality, fail, and somebody needs to make sure it actually works. Here you have an organizational problem. The incentives of fixing problems for real, setting up systems so they actually work well, are small. In my own field of computer science, we have this endless problem that so much code is badly written and it's full of insecurities, but there are no incentives to actually rewrite it in a proper way. That's expensive. And fixing the security flaws is mostly done when somebody exploits it or it becomes a problem. Setting the incentives so these bullshit jobs disappear is tricky because you have Goodhart's law. Anytime when you set up a measure, if you start tracking that measure, you will tend to lose sight of what you actually aim for. So if we start trying to get rid of box tickers and the duct tapers in organizations, we might find soon that we have a new bureaucracy implementing that contains the bullshit jobs. It's a sticky problem. It has to do with that we're bad at optimizing complex systems. But that's no reason not to try it. We can set incentives. We know how to do some forms of programming and complex system design well. We just need to become much better at it.
Thank you so much, Anders. Sorry about the adverse conditions, but as everyone has commented, you are remarkably unflappable. We've talked in the past about how we would all like to clone some of your neurological makeup. And as usual, your talk was so full of insights that I'm sure everyone will want to review it when it's posted. And it will be posted in the UMB and the IET YouTube channels. So thank you again. In 2 weeks, you can join us for John Danaher, and we'll have some of these technicalities fixed by then.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Cheers.
Bye.